Lesson one, repeat after me. No, kid, you can't use my computer.
We're trying to, can you hear me, Judge?
I can hear you. I think it's a filter.
It is, and I don't know how to remove it. I've got my assistant here. She's trying to, but I'm prepared to go forward with it. I'm here live. I'm not a cat.
This is Virtual Selling, an educational web series from Sparks IQ, and I'm not a cat. I'm your host, Jason Levinson. This series is about how the global shift to virtual communication impacts sales. We want to help you adapt so you can succeed in this new frontier, and we've assembled a dream team of business experts to help us do just that. Today, I am joined by the magnificent Mark Magnacca, author of Mastering Virtual Selling. We also have David Bowders, founder and CEO of Sparks IQ. LinkedIn sales influencer and sales enablement expert Mike Kunkel, and Mike's co-author of Modern Sales Foundations, Doug Wyatt. Hi, fellas. How you doing?
Great. Glad to be here, Jason.
Virtual selling spiked in mid-2020, and according to a study by McKinsey, 90% of selling moved to virtual at that time, and virtual communication is still everywhere. For instance, virtual sales experiences jumped a whopping 368% last year. Employees are quitting instead of giving up working from home. Virtual selling is here to stay. How B2B firms can thrive in the future of sales. And those are just some of the headlines. So Mark, you literally wrote the book on virtual selling. So tell us, why did you and your co-authors choose to write Mastering Virtual Selling and choose to write it now?
Sure, Jason. Happy to do it. Look, in March of 2020, we all know that the world changed. What most of us didn't know is that it wouldn't go back to where it was when this whole pandemic began. And what I think has been so surprising, that was a big inspiration for us, was a realization that people were willing to try things because they had to, that in many cases existed, but had not become popular yet. And the ability for people to allow this thing that we went through together to be a catalyst so that we could try different approaches to be more effective and to really start to understand what's important to buyers. In many ways, the pandemic has changed everything about the future of selling. Just as a point of reference, as we move into this more hybrid world, which will include both in-person and virtual meetings, the reality is that at almost every meeting you're going to be part of going forward, there will be some important decision maker who will likely be virtual. And so what that means is your ability to master this domain, your ability to do things before a virtual meeting, during a virtual meeting, and after a virtual meeting will literally set you apart based upon your mastery of this topic.
Great, Mark. Thanks. And David, is there anything that you want to add to what Mark just said?
Well, we already know that even before the pandemic, that buying had largely become a committee type of exercise. That means more and more stakeholders and our prospects and customers are involved in the purchase decision. So fundamentally, when you have that many people, sometimes a half a dozen or more who have a stake in the decision, it's going to be really hard to get people together for a face-to-face meeting. And so that trend towards committee decision-making means that virtual selling, whether we like it or not, is here to stay.
So Doug, you are out there in the trenches every day, selling, talking to buyers. Give us an idea from your perspective of where things are right now.
I mean, I think for a lot of companies, virtual selling is just selling. It's, there are live components. There's a reason to go see customers. But when it comes to other functions in the sales process, kind of what Mark mentioned, there's buying that's happening in between meetings, actually set meetings. There's buying process that's happening during meetings, whether in person or remote. So it's using technology to just be efficient, to David's point. And, there's a reason to see customers in different ways. There's a reason for a phone call. There's a reason for a teleconference. There's a reason to get on a plane and go see them. And it's all about using those different means efficiently.
And this series is about getting good at virtual selling. So David, why do you believe that every salesperson must master virtual selling?
Well, I might correct that a little bit. I would say that every salesperson who wants to win needs to master virtual selling. And that's because ultimately the marketplace that we're in is competitive. There are winners and losers from adoption of new technology. Those sellers who differentiate themselves, who create a better buyer experience, are going to outperform those who continue to be stuck in the old ways of doing things, or even worse, who try to adapt to the new technologies by doing things the old way. You can't just show up for a Zoom meeting and conduct your meetings the way you did when they were face-to-face. It doesn't work. It's a different technology. It's a different idea. And those sellers who master this new way of doing things will outperform those in the marketplace who fail to adapt.
I couldn't agree more. And that's why we're here. Now, some of you might be thinking, this whole virtual thing is temporary. That's just one of the many myths circulating about virtual selling. So throughout this series, we're going to debunk these myths in a segment we're calling Debunked. Mike, see if you can debunk this myth. Virtual selling is a temporary solution.
Way back when this thing called a global pandemic started, Jason, I remember seeing an article from the American Marketing Association, and there have been many since, but this first one struck me because they said, this change was coming for a long time, coming all along. The pandemic just accelerated this shift to virtual. And that made me think back to some of the other changes I've seen, right? The first book on consultative selling was published over 50 years ago, yet we're still not all doing consultative buyer-centric selling. Back in 2013, I was talking about changing buyer behaviors and the need for sellers to adapt to digital selling, even back then. So one of the things that I think we need to realize is that real human behavior change, and therefore organizational behavior change, is a little like watching grass grow, right? Usually this stuff continues over time till it reaches a tipping point, and then finally the change starts to accelerate. But occasionally there's some unpredictable black swan event or something predictable but unexpected, like a global pandemic. It all of a sudden rapidly accelerates and forces change. And we all know that's what happened in our case. But this has been coming a long time. So not only is virtual selling not temporary, I think before long, virtual selling is going to simply become selling. It'll be the way we do things around here, or a standard operating procedure. Probably most important, Jason, buyers and customers don't want us to go back. They like this new way of working with vendors and this new way of buying. I tell you, somebody else who likes it are CFOs, right? Productivity and profit margins can both be higher if you're selling virtually. You just have to do it well to improve effectiveness and efficiency. So I'd say it's not going back.
David, I can tell that you want to add to what Mike's saying. So what are your thoughts?
Well, I think the final nail in the coffin, if you will, of the myth is going to be the reality that work from home is here to stay. Whether it's work from home in part or in total, the reality is that many employees, both within our own companies and within our customers' companies, are working from home. And that's not going to change. We know that there are clear economic and quality of life reasons why employees prefer this. So to hope that we're going to go back to everybody being in the office and flying around the country and wasting time and money and damaging the environment in order to achieve something that buyers don't want is a fantasy. And we need to pull that fantasy away and get rid of it.
Fantasyland is a great part of Disney World, but not great for virtual selling. Okay, so there you have it, folks. Virtual selling is a temporary solution. Debunked. Let's take a few minutes to talk about the increased importance of buyer-centric selling now that selling has evolved to a much more virtual arena. Mike and Doug, you wrote an award-winning buyer-centric sales training program, Modern Sales Foundations. Mike, what do you see salespeople doing out there in their virtual meetings that is not buyer-centric?
Well, first of all, many are still trying to get buyers to have an in-person meeting somewhere. And then when that fails, they wind up in a fallback position that they have a Zoom meeting where then they pretty much are just basically pitching endlessly or making the very same mistakes in a virtual setting that they're making in those in-person meetings, right? They feature dump, they focus on their own needs, they're seller-centric, or they have self-serving agendas, poor meeting management, and not capitalizing on all the possible advantages of a virtual and digital selling situation. That's what I see, Jason.
That's what he sees, and the man has 20/20 vision. So, Doug, would you agree that unless they've had some formal training in buyer-centric selling, and specifically in virtual selling, that there are a lot of salespeople out there who are making a lot of mistakes and frankly, wasting a lot of buyers' time?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think a big part of it is kind of what we've talked about to this point, which is virtual selling is something we see the data, the buyers want it. And if sellers are just showing up on the same calls and doing things that the way they would have done in person, but not really adapting their approach and using technology and making the most of the vehicle for doing it with virtual technology, they're kind of, there's some combination of wasting the buyer's time, not giving the buyers what they actually need. And it becomes just a kind of a below average experience. And that's, we've seen the data points about buyers want virtual. We've also seen data points that buyers aren't thrilled with the way that salespeople are executing on virtual. And it could be as simple as, sellers not even getting on camera or not having a good experience, or it could just be in the way that those meetings are run. It could be that sellers aren't coming with, an agenda ahead of time and doing the things that they need to do to use buyers' time wisely and help buyers get what they need out of that meeting to move forward in the buying process.
Hey, Jason, just on that note, I will just give you a specific example to build on what Doug just said. And that is I had an experience as a buyer. And what we were doing, we were in the process of buying a 401k plan. And what that means is we had 5 different vendors who were working with us to help us figure out what we needed as a 401k. And then we had to select from among this list. And it was an RFP process. It was narrowed down to 5. And then we were to have 5 one-hour calls. So over the course of this 2 weeks, we got to meet 5 different teams of people. And the difference between the way they approached it was just unbelievably striking. The first person that came on literally did the call with camera off. So the camera was off. He said, I'm not that used to this technology. And bear in mind, we're a technology company. And he went through it on voice only, and he was able to show a couple of slides, but it was very clear that he was signaling that he was not in this modern arena. The second group actually did a short form video where they introduced themselves. And it was really interesting because there were 6 people who were part of the team. And in the course of a 2.5-minute video, with a little bit of music even that their company did, they just had their bios and they talked for about 10 to 15 seconds each. But what was amazing is it was as if we kind of got to know them. One of the people said, they knew we were in Boston. He said he has a bromance with Tom Brady and that he's a big fan of Tampa Bay, and he hopes that's not going to be a problem, right? So when you talk about rapport building, the first thing that happened when we got on the call is we talked about that. So the same type of dynamic that would have occurred happened in a virtual arena, but it actually happened in a shorter time frame. The bottom line is, among the 5, 2 of them took the time to create an agenda, to send us a short introductory video, and the calls literally felt more productive and more meaningful because we didn't waste 15 minutes of the time trying to kind of get to know them. And the interesting part is it came down to 2 qualified people. And in the end, between the 2 qualified people, the one who followed the most basic elements of selling, they did what they said they were going to do. They followed up. They showed up on time. Just the basic blocking and tackling, because they were so close, that's what ultimately sealed the deal. So the combination of what I'll call use of technology and then fundamentals of selling are still critical in terms of ultimately winning.
The fundamentals are especially critical when selling virtually, because if you're not buyer-centric with me in a video call, I can very easily.
Jason Levinson. has left the meeting.
To build on that, let's bring on Gila Stern, head of Sparks IQ Studios, to share an example of the impact and need for masterful virtual communication. Hi, Gila. How are you doing today?
Great. Thank you so much for having me. Excited to be here with you guys, virtually, of course.
So we had an experience recently that I thought was pertinent. So let's talk a bit about our recent encounter with virtual communication skills and lack thereof.
I think we all know that making a great first impression is always important, no matter how you're meeting somebody for the first time. Typically, someone can decide if they like you maybe within 7 seconds. But of course, there's recent data that's showing that happens even quicker during a virtual meeting and in video. So that first impression is even more important now virtually than ever before. And given that so many of us are working from home, as David said, it's important to ensure that our surroundings, our offices, our desks, even our dining room tables are reflecting a positive image because they are that first impression. So, during this interview process that we recently went through, it was interesting because I would venture to say that most people wouldn't show up to an in-person interview in their pajamas. So I can't imagine you would want to do it virtually either, but we did see it all. In this process, I think we probably ran about 30 to 40 different virtual interviews. And, we had people show up with baseball hats down to here, banging like this on the desk, which I'm sure you can all tell is not very pleasant to listen to in a half an hour interview. Messy beds behind you. Like I said, we've seen it all. But those that showed up professionally, were the ones who made a lasting impression on us. So I would say it's absolutely important that the representation that you put of yourself virtually is just as important as the one that you do in person, just as important as that physical handshake, if you will.
Over and over again, we see people are just dropping the ball when it comes to showing up in the right way for this new virtual world. I'm on calls now with people where they've got, they're a $15 billion company. And they're the head of the channel who's engaging with some of their most important channel customers, and they still haven't figured out how to get on screen. I'm with executives who run sales forces who lead by the wrong example and show their sales teams that they can't or won't figure out how to be present virtually with some of their most important customers and their own employees. And frankly, it's not doing justice to the workforce. It's not doing justice to your customers when you fail to adopt and adapt to the new realities.
You got to adopt and you got to adapt. That's why we created the series. Mark, your book is titled Mastering Virtual Selling, Orchestrating Sales Success. Would you define what you mean by orchestration and tell everybody how you came up with the idea?
Sure. Happy to do it. First of all, I want you to know that we came up with this totally independent of what I'm about to tell you. And that is one of the most highly respected consulting firms in the world, which is McKinsey, says that they believe the number one skill for B2B salespeople now and going forward is the ability to orchestrate the omni-channel selling experience. What does that mean? Well, what they mean, they're borrowing the term omnichannel from the marketing world. So omnichannel means billboard, it means television commercial, it could mean print media, it could mean digital media. It's all of those different channels of reaching people. That's called the omnichannel. And they ported the example from marketing over to sales. And what they're saying is in the selling process, sellers need to be able to text, maybe Slack. They may need to be able to use LinkedIn messaging. They need to be able to use email, video. All of those things are examples of the omni-channel selling experience. And so to the extent that you get good at that and you can pivot back and forth, you have an advantage. Well, my exposure to this actually came from watching a great orchestra conductor by the name of Benjamin Zander. He happens to be the conductor of the Boston Philharmonic Orchestra. To make a long story short, I was invited to a private event and I got to chat with him before he went out onto the stage. And what I realized, Jason, is there were certain things that Ben Zander did backstage before the concert began. I saw him interacting with the musicians. I saw him doing a number of little rehearsals. There were all of these things designed to make sure that in this case, the customer experience or the people in the audience was going to be great as soon as he walked out on stage. Then he was out front stage. He delivered this concert. He acted as the orchestrator, if you will, the conductor of this orchestra. And then after he came back to the backstage part of the particular building we were in, it continued.
You could light up a village with this guy's eyes.
He took pictures with people. He signed autographs with people. And as I was standing back and watching this, I was realizing that orchestration really is a good metaphor for the sales process. So the big idea of the book ultimately came down to there's two elements that sellers need to think about. There's what we call front stage or synchronous communication. And that's when you're on a live telephone call or you're on a live Zoom call or Teams or any of the other meeting platforms where you and the other people are there at the same moment in time. And then backstage is the term we use to describe anything that is asynchronous. And asynchronous simply means not at the exact same moment in time. So even though you might send someone a text and they may respond just a moment later, it's still asynchronous communication as compared to synchronous. Mm-hmm. So Jason, we took the word front stage and we used it to mean that synchronous communication. And then we took the word backstage and we took that to mean asynchronous communication. And then what we realized is that there's an image that may form in your mind that looks like this timeline. And that is that there's a moment before or some period of time before you go live, if you will, or synchronous front stage. That's a backstage moment. And that's a chance for you to set the stage with an agenda. It's a chance for you to connect with a person on LinkedIn. Maybe if there's multiple people on the call, you're taking a screenshot of their LinkedIn bios so that when you get on the call, you can say, I've sent everybody's LinkedIn in the interest of saving us time. Because in a 30-minute call, if you have 10 people and they each talk for 1 minute in introduction, you've just used up a third of the whole call on that. So we're looking for ways to have efficiencies. So you have this stuff you can do backstage to make the call more efficient. You have these techniques that make you more effective when you are front stage. Things like putting the agenda in the chat, asking for people to ask questions in the chat, asking people to rename themselves and put their name and their title, especially if it's people who haven't met before. And then finally, backstage, after the call ends, being able to send follow-up materials that could include snippets from the call that was recorded, just a key element that was important to people. It could be a part of a thank you message that you send, the next steps. So when you have that more holistic view of front stage and backstage, it gives you a mental reference of what am I supposed to do now to create a better buying experience.
And what we're saying with this series is the better you get at orchestrating the front stage and backstage activities, the better buying experience you can deliver for your prospects and customers.
That's exactly right. And I'll tell you, Jason, when you watch Ben Zander conduct this symphony, the music is just beautiful. And what you realize is there's a reason there's a conductor who's also known as a maestro or a master. There's a reason for that person, because just left to their own devices, the individual musicians cannot play the music as well as when there's one person in the center orchestrating it.
Mike, how do you wrap your head around the idea of orchestration in sales?
Jason, I actually studied music and have done conducting, so it's really a perfect fit, in my opinion. I've been a proponent of omnichannel prospecting for years, and now with all the advanced technology we've got, we live in a perfect world for orchestrating omnichannel selling. Look, reps are already doing a lot of this, right? They're doing email and voicemail, phone, chat, video prospecting. They're just not doing it incredibly well, and they're not mixing the channels well, choosing the right ones for the right purpose or adapting their communication style to the channel. This is all part of orchestration. To me, though, the real orchestration is that taking the baton metaphor, right? Is purposely leading, you're facilitating, you're sort of guiding the performance or the buying journey. I've seen reps do the right thing and line up the right executives or subject matter experts on their side to align with the attendees from the buyer side. But then, rather than taking that baton and conducting that meeting, the rep winds up deferring to the highest ranking leader on their side, who, by the way, doesn't come into that meeting expecting to lead the meeting. And then it's chaos, right? So reps need to lead, introduce, facilitate, guide, but never abdicate or fade into the background. Just like an orchestra conductor, right? Who sets the tempo, cues the right players at the right time, and generally leads a beautiful performance that leaves the audience really satisfied. If you think about that, that is a great metaphor.
Yeah, I think that one of the key points here is that we actually call backstage a stage, because that means it's every bit as important as the front stage. So all those activities that we do when we're not face-to-face virtually with the customer are equally important from the customer experience perspective. So we have to give them that type of importance. And the way we do that is through our language and through the way that we talk about and think about the importance of these daily activities that lead up to a face-to-face meeting and that follow a face-to-face meeting. It's tempting to just call them the details or the prep work, but they're not. They're actually a full part of the customer's experience. And that's why I really like the front stage and particularly the backstage idea. The whole value of the metaphor, if you will, of orchestration is that it focuses you on the totality of what you're doing. It's not just the individual pieces. It's not just the pre-meeting preparation. It's not just the meetings where you're face-to-face with the customer. And it's not just what you do after the meeting. It's the entirety of the experience that changes. And so that lens that we see the world through with the term orchestration focuses us on the totality and not just the details or the pieces of the experience.
I'm less likely to shoot off a clumsy email to a prospect if I'm aware of the larger buyer experience that I'm orchestrating. And for a salesperson to position themselves to successfully orchestrate, they need to get smart about technology. And lucky for us, every episode, my colleague, Jeanette Abrahamson, teaches us something new about the tech associated with virtual selling. So Jeanette, let's talk tech.
I'm Jeanette with Sparks IQ. Today, we're going to talk about cameras. Not that kind of camera, and not this kind either. I'm talking about the cameras we use for virtual meetings. A few years ago, when everyone fumbled through video meetings, most people were super forgiving. But poor video performance just won't cut it anymore. The good news is that I have a few tips that'll make you look a lot more professional. Use a high definition camera. That doesn't mean you need to invest thousands of dollars in expensive cameras. The first thing you need to do is evaluate the quality of your existing gear. If your computer has a built-in webcam, you'll want to check the resolution. Resolution is the total number of pixels your camera is capturing. This is 1 pixel. The more pixels in your video, the higher the resolution. The higher the resolution, the better your video looks. 720 is the lowest resolution I'd recommend, but you'll probably want an HD camera that shoots 1080. That's over 2 million pixels. If you really want to go above and beyond, look at getting a 4K camera. 4K has about 4 times more resolution than 1080 HD, which is why 4K video looks so much better. If your built-in camera just isn't cutting it anymore, there are lots of different cameras that can plug right into your computer. You just need to tell your video conferencing tool to use the new camera. Another great feature you'll find in apps like Zoom is Touch Up My Appearance. It's like a digital facial. Now we need to talk about wardrobe. Don't worry, you can still wear sweatpants and slippers. Your top is likely the only thing making it on camera. Solid colors tend to be best, and tight patterns like pinstripes can be distracting on camera, so save those for in-person meetings. With just a few small adjustments, you'll be looking like a pro in no time.
Thanks, Jeanette, for some great advice on cameras and wardrobe. I learned something. And I'm sure that everyone out there did as well. And I hope you go out there and use it. Now, that's all we have on the docket for today. But over the next few episodes, we're going to be digging into the ideas of front stage and backstage and sharing best practices for each. So be sure to tune in so that you can avoid worst practices like this.
So starting just quickly by breathing in. And breathing out. And it's really challenging, I know, with children home from school and working from home, but just trying to just keep all of those distractions out of the way.
A big thanks to Mark, David, Mike, and Doug for a great episode. Everybody say goodbye.
Great to be with you.
Thank you, everyone.
And we will see you right back here for our next episode, which digs into the idea of front stage selling. Goodbye, everybody.